Welcome, everyone, to the Forum at Friendship. Of course, it's not really at Friendship, it's in your own homes tonight. I'm here in my own home in my Buchanan man cave with books and sports memorabilia surrounding me, and very, very glad to have all of you joining us as well for tonight's presentation called Mirrors of God: Why Christians Should Care About Climate Change. And our guest tonight is the Reverend Dr. Richard Floyd. Richard received his Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, and his PhD from Emory University with a focus on theology and creation. His book, Down to Earth, we get it right here, Down to Earth, Christian Hope and Climate Change, was published by Cascade Books in 2015. He has edited a series of devotionals with Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann and published several articles in the Feasting on the Word series. Richard is a Presbyterian minister, PCUSA minister, and has served churches in Atlanta, outside Chicago, and presently in Western North Carolina. He also taught at Columbia Theological Seminary for a little bit, and presently lives in Hickory, North Carolina with his wife, Emily, and his dog, Mo, who serves as his spiritual advisor. And he's not kidding. All of that is fancy schmancy stuff. I'll just say that Richard and I have been very good friends for 15 years now. And I'm very excited to have you do this program tonight. Richard?
Yes, well, thank you, Tom. And my thanks to all of you for being here. And it's kind of fun because I'm seeing folks from some of my different stops along the way. I see some Atlanta folks and some Hickory folks and some folks that I met at Friendship. So I'm excited about that and getting to be with you tonight. And my thanks to Tom and Friendship for doing this. I think it's great that you guys put on these forums and give people the opportunity to think about, what's going on in the world and issues of faith and how those things intersect. So glad to be here and really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm hoping that you all can now see my PowerPoint. I'm going to use that to kind of go through my little talk here. As I do it this way, you all kind of almost disappear from my screen. So I'm just going to talk for a while. And then when I'm done, I'll unshare and there may not be anyone left in the room and I won't know. That's okay. Do what you need to do. But I look forward to just getting to spend this time with you tonight. So I always love starting with this image, Earthrise, right? This is from Apollo 8, I think 1968. This photo was taken. And it's, it's been colorized, but it's really the first time that we had a photo of the planet Earth. And it's kind of fascinating to think about that's actually, I wasn't actually alive in 1968. So this was before I was born, but some of you, I imagine, were alive before 1968. Before that time, we had never seen the planet Earth in quite this way. And I think that this moment of taking a step back and looking back at the Earth and seeing it as this one beautiful, somewhat fragile planet kind of shaped people's consciousness or started to shape people's consciousness. So that goes all the way back to 1968. And then, if I can get that moving, and then of course you get 1970, a couple of years later, April 22nd, you get the first Earth Day. And I don't think that's an accident. I think consciousness of the Earth as being sort of one place that we all share started to shift our consciousness about how we think about the Earth, how we care for it, how we relate to it. So you get this wonderful event in April 22nd, 1970, where people around the world started celebrating the Earth and our need to care for it. If we weren't doing this via Zoom, I would ask you all where you were on April 22nd, 1970, and maybe some of you all could tell me what you did to celebrate Earth Day. I'm sure there are some stories there, but because we're on Zoom and because time is short, we'll save that for another conversation. So before I move on, I want to say just a little bit about kind of the journey I'm hoping we're going to take tonight. So We're going to talk for just a few minutes about climate change and what I mean by climate change. And then we're going to look at some specifically kind of Christian responses to climate change. And we'll look for just a minute at some responses that maybe haven't been helpful in helping to shape a healthy relationship with creation. And then a whole series of other responses that I think are more helpful to do that. So that's kind of the journey we're going to take. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about climate change itself. Now, I want to say up front, we're not really going to talk much about science because I'm not a climate scientist, and I don't purport to be. I've done my best to keep up to date on climate science as it emerges, but obviously I'm not a scientist in that way. Maybe some of you are, I don't know, but generally when I give these talks, none of us in the room are climate scientists, so that we can only go so far in the science of climate change. But the good news for the purposes of our conversation is we only have to share three basic assumptions in order for us to be able to move on. And there is tremendous scientific consensus around these three claims. So I'm trying to point to what I think is kind of the 99% scientific consensus around climate change. It's just three simple points. Point number one, climate change is happening. Point number two, human beings are at least partly responsible. That doesn't mean we're entirely responsible. That doesn't mean there aren't other factors and forces at play, but climate change is clearly happening. Human beings are at least partly responsible for what's happening. And then three, it's not good. In other words, it is producing negative results, and therefore we need to consider how we can respond to that and mitigate what's happening with climate change. So I'm going to talk, this kind of gives you we're not spending much time on it all, but it gives you kind of a big snapshot of what we mean when we talk about climate change. So this graph is basically, 30,000 years of climate history on one graph. And if you look at kind of the zero line right in the middle, that's sort of the default standard temperature, and then up and down as anomalies off of that. And you look at that blue part of the line. I wish I could point. I don't think there's any way I can point that you can see it, but there's this blue part of the line somewhat in the middle.
It's doing it.
Yeah. Oh, so you can see what I'm pointing to.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
That shows that's about 10,000 years of history. And for those 10,000 years, the average global temperatures have vacillated only up or down by half a degree. So that's been, it's called the Holocene period, right? And that 10,000 years represents really almost the entirety of human civilization, right? Everything that we know of as really human civilization shows up in that little 10,000 year stretch of history where the temperatures were kind of right in this Goldilocks sweet spot. Mm-hmm. So you can see right as you get to the end of that, right? At the very end, you get the Industrial Revolution, right? And then you notice the line starts to move upward, and you can see this sort of reddish orange line that launches disturbingly into the sky, right? Everyone can see that an anomaly is happening here. This is representing a significant departure from the normal trends of temperature variance. And so when this graph was first created, and I think it was a couple of years ago, actually, it was created to mark that moment when for the first time in, tens of thousands of years, temperatures actually exceeded that Holocene band. So you can see that little dot right up there where we went up above beyond where we had ever been before. And then the rest of these line are projections. And of course, some of them are rather scary. This is 2 degrees and then onward and upward. Those are things that have not happened yet, but things that science currently projects based on emissions that we have already put into the atmosphere. So this is why this conversation is taking place now. It's because of this rather startling anomaly. And in geologic terms, this is astonishingly fast. I mean, it may have taken place over a couple of generations from our perspective, which seems like a long time, 100 years, let's say. But in terms of geology, that's an incredibly fast time of change, which is why the line shoots straight up. So this is the line that we're sort of concerned about and talking about when we talk about climate change. Mm-hmm. So Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is kind of the UN organization, and it's made up of international scientists, kind of the global community of scientists. And every 6 or 7 years, they put out a report that states the consensus of science about where climate change stands. So the most recent one was last year in 2022. So I just want to share with you a couple of things that came out of that report. So this is the 2022 IPCC climate report. So here are some of the conclusions they drew. Climate impacts are already more widespread and severe than expected. And partly that's because, if you can imagine, you get a whole room full of international scientists together. By the nature of the beast, their conclusions are going to be somewhat conservative. You have to find the most conservative consensus to get everyone to sign off on it. And what we have discovered time and again is those conservative predictions have tended to be a little too conservative, and reality has pretty consistently outstripped those predictions. So that's the first thing they observed, was that things are happening more widespread and more severely than their prior report expected. We are locked into even worse near-term impacts. In other words, we know, based on emissions that have already taken place, we've already pumped them into the atmosphere, we know that there are deeper impacts ahead of us that we have not hit yet. Risks will escalate quickly with higher temperatures. It's important to remember with all of this climate change stuff that we're talking about what do I want to say? Like feedback loops. And we could get into all the science of that, which is interesting, but we really don't have time for it. But basically, there are mechanisms where certain thresholds are crossed, and then you hit a feedback loop where it starts feeding back on itself and accelerating. So I'll give you an example of that. There's ice covering the Arctic Sea, and the ice is white. But the ice, as the water gets warmer, temperatures get warmer, the ice melts. And instead of that nice white ice, you get dark seawater. Well, dark seawater absorbs more sunlight and therefore more heat than the ice did. The ice reflected more heat back. So in other words, the cycle accelerates because it starts feeding on itself. So the point is, as the temperatures go up, the risks escalate quickly, which is why keeping our temperatures down as much as possible is so important. Inequality heightens climate risk. And this is just important to acknowledge that there is a justice issue at play here, because, it's, to broadly state it, most of the emissions are coming from the first world and most of the impacts are being felt by the third world, right? So there is a kind of justice issue here that the people who are absorbing them, who are projecting the most climate change chemicals into the atmosphere, are the ones most able to acclimate to it, and the folks least able to acclimate to it are the ones feeling the impact. So it's important to be aware of that, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Adaptation is crucial. Obviously, the report is arguing we need to be working on adaptation mechanisms vigorously. Some impacts are already too severe to adapt to. The estimate is that in 2022, there were 30 million climate refugees. That is, people who had to leave their home and move because of weather and climate issues. So already 30 million, that's the estimate from 2022. The projection for 2050 on the path we're currently on is that that number would quadruple. So we'd be looking at 120 million climate refugees in the year 2050. That's a lot of people who are being uprooted and having to move because of the impacts of climate change. So we're just recognizing we're already seeing some spots of God's good green earth that used to be habitable that are becoming uninhabitable because of climate change. And of course, the expectation is that will accelerate. 1.5 degrees has been kind of the consensus number among scientists for a while, that trying to keep the temperature increase to 1.5 or under is thought to be a pretty healthy threshold we don't want to blow past if we can help it. The trends don't look great. At the moment, it looks like we're kind of gonna blow past 1.5, but it's not too late. The window for action is closing, but it's not closed yet. And I want to add that it's really never too late, because this isn't like a lever that's either on or off. Either climate change happens or it doesn't. The truth is, it's a matter of degrees, right? And so even if we can, only go 1.75 instead of 1.8, that could make a huge difference in how it impacts the planet and how it impacts people's lives. So it's never too late to engage the issue, even if staying below 1.5 is looking increasingly problematic. Mm-hmm. So here's a nice summary from the IPCC 2022 report. The UN report on how climate change harms people and the environment reads like an atlas of human and planetary suffering. The report says the world is going to get sicker, hungrier, poorer, gloomier, and more dangerous in the next 17 years. That's before 2050. I'm glad I can't see who's still in the room, because I imagine half of you have hit the exit button at this point, because that's a pretty gloomy and depressing place. We're not going to stop here. We're not going to end here. But I think it's important to get a pretty clear sense of what we're dealing with and what we're talking about. And, climate change is a significant issue that's going to impact, it's already impacting our lives. I have two younger daughters. It's certainly going to impact their lives, and it's going to impact the lives of their children and their children. So it's an important issue, and it's important for the Christian church, I think, to think carefully and critically about this issue and then respond faithfully. So that kind of sums up sort of what the situation has been thus far. But we're going to turn the corner now and move on to some Christian responses. So, why should we care? It's a lot of gloomy, scientific numbers and facts, and why should we care about this? I'm going to give you several kind of layers of reasons. We're not going to talk about most of them, because really my focus is going to be on the Christian tradition, but I do want to acknowledge a few of these others. So the first layer is the most basic. It's human survival. If I can motivate you to care about this for no other reason than this might be enough. And that is that it is conceivable that human beings could wreck the environment to such an extent that it won't sustain human life. I'm not saying we're close to that or that's going to happen anytime soon, but that's not impossible. So if for no other reason, we should care about this issue, because human survival should be important to us, the survival of our children and their children and the folks who come behind us. But I think there's an even more maybe not more compelling, but another compelling layer to that: human fulfillment. It's not, we don't just need nature for survival. Nature brings us joy. It brings us life. It enriches our lives. I take my dog Mo, my spiritual guide, for a walk several times a day, and we walk through the changing leaves, and we can see Black Mountain off in the distance, and nature is healing to us and brings us joy and brings us life. And so to diminish that diminishes our lives. So we should care about it, not just for our survival, but for our joy, for our happiness, for our health, for our thriving. And then another layer is, you could talk about the ethics of all of this. Does nature have its own value that we should be trying to protect? Is it ethical for us to be leading to the extinction of so many species? Or do we have an ethical obligation to try to care for and sustain the biodiversity of planet Earth? So there's a whole ethical conversation to be had here. Again, that's not the conversation we're going to have, but I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. And then finally, is, we could say, sort of the theological piece, the God piece of all of this. And that's, I'm a Christian theologian, so that's obviously where I'm going to turn most of my attention. But I want to at least acknowledge there are lots of layers of motivation for why we ought to care about climate change and care about creation. So I want to start with spending just a couple of minutes on some parts of the Christian faith that haven't always been helpful in thinking about creation and thinking about climate change. And we could spend a lot of time on this. I wish we had more time to spend on it, but I'm just going to name three and just touch on them really briefly. So first, we could talk about the dominion tradition in Christianity. And of course, that goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Then God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all the wild animals of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them, back in Genesis 1. This has often been interpreted as saying human beings have been given total dominion over creation to do whatever we want to do with it. Creation is ours to use, abuse, exploit however we need to. I'll just say that I think that's a bad reading of the text. It's been read that way before, but I don't think that's a faithful reading. I don't think that's what you find If you look through the rest of the Old Testament, you find traditions that pull in a different direction, and in the New Testament as well. And I'll just give you one thing to think about. The word dominion, comes from the Latin dominus, which means Lord. I mean, dominion means lordship. So Christians, as people of faith, have to ask themselves, what does lordship look like? What does it mean to be Lord? And someone maybe can pipe in. You probably can hear where I'm going with this. How should a Christian define lordship? Well, the first place we should look is Jesus Christ, right? In the New Testament, Jesus is Lord. So lordship should look something like what we see in Jesus. So if we're called to exercise lordship over creation, surely that doesn't mean exploiting, taking advantage of, taking no care for. It should look like what we see in Jesus. And what we see there is not that. What we see in lordship in Jesus is suffering love, caring for, empowering, sacrificing for. So you see, that little turn should change the whole way we think about the dominion tradition found in Genesis 1. So again, we could spend a lot more time on that, but I'm going to keep moving here. A second kind of trend in Christian theology that hasn't always been helpful on this question is this great word anthropocentrism, which just means human beings at the center of it all. People have read the Bible to suggest that it's really all about human beings. God created the world simply for human beings so that the human story could play out, and creation really doesn't matter. It's all about the human story. I'll just add again that I think that's a poor reading. For one thing, I think obviously the Bible focuses on the human story. It was written by human beings. I've joked before that, if the Bible were written by cats, you can bet that cats would be the apple of God's eye, and cats would be the crown of creation, and it would all be about, chasing mice and that sort of thing. So, but cats didn't write the Bible, humans did. So of course we focused on the human story. That's no surprise. So that makes it all the more surprising when you read through the Bible and you find all these texts which say, it's not really about you guys. It's not all about human beings. And I wish we had time. The best one of those is the book of Job. You all, I'm sure, know the book of Job well. I keep looking to the side because that's where I can see your faces. But I know if I look here, I'm actually looking at you. So sorry if you can't tell which way I'm looking. The book of Job, this great, Job suffers all these terrible tragedies and he cries out to God for justice and answers. And then God finally appears in the whirlwind. And what does God say to Job? How does God answer Job? God basically says, Job, have you seen the platypus? Isn't it amazing? Have you ever seen a whale? Whales are really cool. What God says is basically that creation is so much bigger than you, Job. You couldn't possibly understand how all the pieces fit together. And while your suffering is real and important, it's not cosmic. There's a lot more going on here. And so even the book of Job, even the Bible itself, pushes back on this idea that human beings are the center of creation. God's story is bigger than human beings, even in the Bible. And then a final trend in Christian theology that isn't always helpful is kind of broadly eschatology. Eschatology refers to teachings about the end of things, how the world ends, what human destiny is. And we could spend a lot of time with this. In fact, a good bit of my book is really about eschatology. So this is something I spent a lot of time with. Some Christian traditions have this image of the end of all things that suggests the earth is just kind of a battlefield where good and evil fight it out, and then good wins and the earth kind of gets burned up, so that it doesn't really have enduring significance. I think that's a poor reading of the text, as I've already said. Or then other traditions imagine that ultimately our ultimate destiny is some other world, that we're just sort of passing through the earth. Earth is just a way station. Again, I think that's a poor reading too, and we're going to get to that in a minute. I think God's commitment to this creation is absolute, at least in the Bible. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that. So there are some threads in the Christian tradition that in some ways have not been helpful for thinking about how we relate to creation. So let's turn a corner here and talk about some threads that maybe are helpful for thinking about how we relate to creation and how we think about climate change. So I love this idea of the green church, being a church that is, you don't have to be green, but a church that is attentive to creation and attentive to the world that God so loves, right? John 3:16, the world, God so loves the world. This is the world that God loves. We're called as people of faith to love it too. And that includes all creatures of our God and King, all creatures great and small. So what might a green church look like? I don't know if any of you have this. Maybe you can see on your screen. I actually happen to have my copy right here. Let me see that. This is called the Green Bible. And it might seem a little obnoxious, but probably many of you, when you were kids, and maybe still today, have a red letter Bible. You know what I'm talking about? It's a Bible where the words of Jesus are printed in red, and it helps to kind of lift those off the page. Well, the Green Bible came out, I don't know, 10 years ago, I think, something like that. And what it did was it went through the Bible, Old and New Testament, and found passages that talked about creation and put them in green, just to kind of lift them off the page. And it really is sort of wonderful. If you ever get your hands on one of these, Tom may have a copy if you want to borrow them and you're in his world. It's really kind of wonderful to just flip through it and see all the green, that creation actually is a major player in Scripture, and we just haven't been in the habit of looking for it or seeing it. The glasses we wear when we read the Scripture affects what we see, right? And if we're not thinking about creation, if we're not asking questions about creation, it doesn't even occur to us to look for it. But if we put those glasses on, and I'm hoping maybe as a part of this conversation, next time you go to the Bible, you'll put those glasses on, all of a sudden you see green everywhere. You see creation is an important part of God's work with the world. It really is God and human beings and creation. That's the story taking place in the Bible, not just God and human beings. So I want to spend just a few minutes looking at 3 or 4 texts in the Bible that I think really provide interesting insight into creation and what our relationship to creation should be and why we should care. Now, I should say, if this were a 3-week or a 6-week class, we could spend a week on each of these texts because they're fascinating. They're really amazing what's going on in each of these, because we have basically 15-30 minutes now. I'm going to go really fast. So you'll have to take my word for it, and maybe this will kind of drive you to go back to the Bible and look at some of these texts a second time. So obviously the first text, Genesis 1, the creation stories, which is really amazing poetry. I'll tell you, I have almost no interest in, whether or not, how the creation story lines up with what science tells us about creation and whether it's 6 24-hour days or whatnot. I think Genesis 1 is incredible poetry and beautiful, inspired poetry, and it tells us about God and creation. It's not really trying to answer scientific questions, so I don't get really caught up with that. But I do think it's a beautiful text about the world, and what's the word that is repeated over and over again in Genesis 1 as we go through the days of creation and as the different pieces and parts are explained and defined over and over again. It says, and God saw that it was good, right? Over and over again, we hear that refrain. It was good, it was good, it was good. So the Bible makes it clear right up front that creation is good. And creation's good. God is the one saying it's good. So creation is good because God says it's good. And I'll just point out, that's before human beings even show up in the creation story. So it's not that creation is good for human beings. Obviously, it's good for us. We wear it and we eat it and it's beautiful. So creation is good for us, but that's not all. It's good for God. God says creation is good. And so that means it has a goodness kind of prior to human beings, which I think is important to note. One other thing about Genesis, 2 other things about Genesis that I think are amazing. One is, over and over again, it has God saying, let there be, let the sea bring forth life, let there be light. That phraseology in the Hebrew is a very interesting tense. It's not an imperative. In grammar, an imperative is a command. It's not God saying, seas, bring forth life. Instead, it's a type of grammar that says, let's do this. It's an invitation. It's God saying, seas, let's create fish. So it's this wonderful way God is actually inviting creation to participate in the creative process. It's not God on high, with just a lightning bolt or a magic wand making things happen. It's actually God inviting creation to take part in its own creation. So creation itself is partners with God in bringing the world about. I just think that's wonderful. And it's right there, in the Hebrew. It's right there in the text. So I think that's amazing. The one other thing I want to say about this text is you get all the way to day 6, and of course, human beings show up. We actually looked at that text. God creates human beings in God's image. But then it's very interesting. After all the other days when living things are brought about, God says it was good. And then human beings are created, and God actually doesn't say, and God looked and it was good. Instead, what it says is God creates human beings, blesses them, gives them a command to be fruitful and multiply. And then what happens? Then God sort of steps back and looks at all that God has made, and behold, it was very good. So that's very interesting. Human beings do not get their own individual good. Lots of other creatures do. Lots of other days of creation get that. Human beings don't get their own good. In fact, our goodness is somehow tied up with the very goodness of the whole creation. That's where our goodness comes from. It at least invites the idea that maybe human beings aren't always good. Like our goodness depends upon living within the very goodness of creation, a very goodness that we can sometimes get out of harmony with. So I'm just fascinated by the text kind of invites us to think about that idea that our goodness is contingent upon our participation in the goodness of creation. So that's a real challenge to lay in front of us. Mm-hmm. Finding God, Exodus 3. This is the story of Moses and the burning bush. Again, wonderful story. We could spend a lot of time with it. I'm not going to spend much time with it, except to say that this is an example of a theme that shows up over and over again in the Bible, that God speaks to us through nature, through creation. That's one of the primary means by which God communicates with us. And so being attentive to it, spending time in creation, but being attentive to it, listening to it, looking lovingly and expectantly toward creation I think we're called to do that. And even more, if we don't do that, or if we actually destroy parts of creation because we don't find them useful, we might be destroying the very bush through which God wishes to communicate with us, right? If someone had come along and cut down the bush that ended up burning, that called Moses to go let the people of Israel, let my people go, the whole Bible could have been just one book long instead of as long as it was. But fortunately, that bush was there and it was able to catch fire, and Moses was able to encounter God through it. So we should think twice before we tear any part of creation out, because we don't know the means that may be a means through which God intends to speak to us and commune with us. Read that Exodus story again sometime and contemplate that. So Genesis 2, this is actually, there are 2 creation stories. Genesis 2 is the second creation story. And it's a wonderful story and gets much more sort of hands-on and personal. Genesis 1, God is kind of sort of a master orchestra conductor. Genesis 2, God gets really close and creates human beings. And that's the text where, God shapes human beings out of the clay, out of the dust of the earth, and then breathes life into them. And that's how they come into being. This is an important reminder that we're made out of dust. Even the Bible says we are made out of the same stuff that all of the rest of creation is made out of. Yes, God has breathed the Spirit into us, so we have this Spirit that enlivens us, but we're made out of the same stuff. We are connected to, we are kin with all of creation. And the amazing thing is, the Bible knew this, thousands of years ago. Science, of course, has now come along and said, yeah, this is 100% true, that we all are borrowing atoms for a season, and we warm them up and they spin up and we live them for a while and then we pass them on. We're all sharing the same sort of material stuff. We're made out of the same stuff. And in fact, that we share 98% of our DNA we share with chimpanzees. Isn't that an amazing thought? Chimpanzees and human DNA is about 98% identical. 2% of our DNA makes the difference between human beings and chimpanzees. By the way, I looked it up because I know it matters to people. It's 90% for cats. Cats are 90% identical to human DNA, and it's only 82% for dogs. Now, I'm a dog lover, so I'm troubled by this realization, because I'm suspicious of cats, but that's what the numbers say. But think about that. Cats are 90% human. Dogs are 82%. So we are connected to creation far more intimately than we usually think. And the Bible itself shows us that all the way back in Genesis 2. We are made out of the same stuff. So turning real quick to the prophets, this is the prophet Micah, and the beloved text. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God? Over and over again, the prophets in the Bible are calling us to care for the most vulnerable members of society. And in the Bible, that's generally widows and orphans and strangers. Those are kind of the three categories that show up over and over again in the Bible as those who are vulnerable. And I would argue that creation could just as easily and really should be considered a fourth part of that, because what this represents are parts of God's creation that do not have a voice. Widows and orphans and strangers didn't have a voice in the Old Testament or the New Testament, and that's why the Bible calls us to give them a voice, to care for them. Well, I would argue creation itself does not have a voice unless we give it a voice. So I think that prophetic critique should extend to widows, orphans, strangers, and creation itself. I'll add one more thing from Micah: do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Humbly, the word humility, the root of humility, the root of humble is humus, which means dirt. It means earth. To be humble is to be close to the ground, close to the earth. So to walk humbly with God is literally to walk the earth with God, to walk the land. So I think Micah 6 almost literally is calling us to take off our shoes and walk close to the earth, to care. That's how we walk with God, is by walking close to the earth. Man, I wish we had more time on all of these, because I feel like I could really get going, but I'm trying to control myself. All right. Romans 8, the full impact. So, Romans 8 and the idea of creation waiting with eager longing for the children of God to be revealed. That we all have heard the creation groans, right? That creation has been put into bondage. Boy, it's hard for me to read that text today and not think about climate change and sort of the weight of the weight of our environmental impact on the world. That in some sense, our choices, and in the beginning, they were perfectly innocent choices. I want to be clear about that. We had no idea when we first figured out how to burn carbon and the kind of energy that was going to produce and how we could build an economy around that. We had no idea what the negative results would be generations down the road. So nobody, human beings were not being intentionally sinful or corrupt, but now we do know. Now we see the impacts of some of these choices. But so the sense that creation is in bondage, sort of groaning under the weight of human choices, boy, that rings really true to me as I reflect on our relationship to nature. And this idea that creation is waiting with eager longing for the children of God to be revealed. Boy, I hear that and I think creation is waiting for us to start acting like children of God, right? Creation is waiting for human beings to start practicing lordship in the way we see in Christ, to start caring and serving and sacrificing for the good of creation rather than lordship as domination and exploitation. So I think creation is crying out, groaning for us to act like children of God. So I think Romans 8, is a wonderful and sort of haunting text to think about our relationship to the natural world. And then the new earth of Isaiah 65. Isaiah 65 is to me almost the high point of the Old Testament. So I encourage all of you to pull out your Bible sometime and read Isaiah 65, especially chapter 17 through 25. I'm creating a new heaven and a new earth. Beautiful text giving us a vision of God's dream, God's future for creation. And while it does talk about a new earth, it's important to see in that text that the new earth is not an elimination or a canceling of the old earth. Instead, the new earth is the old earth healed and restored and brought to fullness. And so, people have children, and there's no premature death, and people live to a ripe old age and live full lives, and they get to plant crops and build houses and eat the crops and live in their houses and live in peace, and there's no more war, and there's no more suffering, and there's no more stealing and taking. So it's a vision of this creation transformed, healed, but we remain a part of this creation in that great vision. We don't escape. There's no escape hatch, at least in Isaiah 65, to some other world. This is still the world where we live out our lives with God. This is still the world where we walk humbly with God. But we walk in a world that's being transformed by God and by us as we work with God. The part of that text that says, the translation you're going to see says, I am about to create, but the Hebrew is better, I am creating. And so it's underway. It's already happening. It's just not complete yet. And we are called to participate in that work, in God's work of healing and mending creation. All right, I want to just throw a couple of theological ideas on the table in the next 5 minutes, and then give or take, and then we'll take a break. And I would love to hear from you if any of you are still conscious after my rambling journey through the Bible and now through Calvin. Boy, it's really getting sexy now. Now we've got Calvin on the Calvin is not always, the fun at party guy. Most people would not think of Calvin as a tree hugger or anything along those lines. But actually, if you spend some time with Calvin, he has some really interesting things to say about creation. By the way, those of you who don't know why I'm talking about John Calvin, the Presbyterian tradition, the Reformed tradition that I come out of, and Friendship Presbyterian Church obviously comes out of, John Calvin is kind of our instigator. So we always have to go back to Calvin to see what he might have to say about something. And so finding anything positive to say about creation in Calvin is a pretty good deal. I think Tom is holding up Calvin's
Institutes
as a show off to show that he's got it there. Mine are behind me, Tom, so I've got my copy too.
Right.
Maybe as well worn as yours. But Calvin really actually does have some interesting things to say about creation. I'm going to just lift up three quick ideas that sort of come out of my reading of Calvin that I think talk about our relationship to creation. Boy, I'm just so fascinated by this idea. Calvin and our whole the Reformed tradition is almost obsessed with the idea of idolatry, right? And idolatry, obviously in the oldest sense meant literally, idols, like creating, tangible gods that we fall down and worship instead of worshiping the God of all creation. We try to worship things we can see because we don't have the faith to worship the God that we can't see. Calvin already recognized that the most dangerous idols are not the ones that, are not a statue that we create and put in front of our house and then bow down to. The most dangerous idols are the ones in our mind. They're the ideas that we have about God, that we would rather worship those ideas than worship the living God. And one of the ways that he thinks about idolatry is it's as if we have an infinite space inside of us, and we try to fill that infinite space with finite things. And again, if we were in a room together, I'd ask the critical question: how many finite things does it take to fill an infinite space? And of course, the answer is you can never do it. You can never fill an infinite space with finite things. Only an infinite God can fill an infinite space, which is Calvin's whole point. And, this idea that, our hearts are restless until they find our rest in thee. Only God can fill this infinite space, but we don't wait for God to fill it. We try to fill it with finite things. So I want you to imagine it as if you have an infinite hunger. You're hungry all the time. And this image of consuming the world as a way of trying to fill this emptiness in our soul that really can only be filled by God. So since it can never be filled, we just keep eating and eating and eating and consuming and consuming and consuming. I don't think that's a bad image of, if you could get, take the extraterrestrial view of Earth and watch us like a plague of locusts, sort of just munching up the earth, consuming it. In some ways, I think it's our idolatry playing out. It's our attempt to fill this infinite hunger with finite things. And since you can never get there, you just keep eating and eating and eating. And eating's a metaphor. I just mean consuming more generally. So I love this. I don't love it. I'm haunted by it, but it's a fascinating idea that idolatry might drive our sort of hyper consumption. Another idea from Calvin that I think is really, really wonderful. The Christian tradition has talked for a long time about what it called the two books. There was the book of Scripture and the book of nature. And the understanding was that both of those books were important for understanding God, that nature itself could teach us about God in this as much as Scripture could. Calvin didn't use quite that language, but he did talk about nature as a school. This idea that as we walk around in nature, we are being taught lessons, that God is teaching us about the divine nature through nature all around us. So it's a school for us to learn and grow in our understanding of God. And obviously, we need to do everything we can to not trash our school, right? I mean, the school only works if we attend to it attentively. If we walk around oblivious to it or exploit it, then we can't learn. We can't see the lessons that God is trying to teach us through the school of nature. And then finally, this idea of creation and mirrors of God. That's actually what I called this whole talk, Mirrors of God. I was trying to be, provocative and enticing. I can probably none of you even remember that's what I called it, but I was trying to set it up and then get all the way to the end of it and then give you the big payoff at the end. But this idea, and it really comes from Calvin, though you can find it in Scripture and in other theologians as well, this idea that all creatures are mirrors, and our purpose is to reflect God's glory back, to reflect God's glory back to God, but also to reflect God's glory to each other and to all creation. If you're Presbyterian, what is the chief end of human beings? The chief end of human beings is to glorify God and enjoy God forever. Glorify God. We glorify God by being mirrors, by reflecting God's glory back. I think that's such a beautiful image of all creation as sort of like a net of diamonds. That's actually an image out of the Hindu tradition, but it works here too. Or you can see this image I have of like the sea and all these infinite points of light reflecting the divine glory back. So two thoughts about that, and then I'm going to wrap up and invite any questions or conversation we want to have. One, if we destroy creatures, we destroy mirrors of God. In other words, if every creature or every species certainly reflects the divine glory in its own particular way, in a way that nothing else can. My dog Mo reflects God's glory in a Mo-like way. And there are certain things I can learn about God. I can see about God's glory in Mo that I can't see about God's glory, especially in cats. Again, another cat joke, just because I thought I'd throw that out there. But no, cats reflect God's glory in their own way, and so do wildebeests and fish, and every bird has its own distinct reflection of God's glory. For a species to go extinct is like breaking that mirror. It's like extinct. The word extinct literally comes from putting out a candle, right? You're breaking a mirror so that creation's ability to reflect divine glory is a little bit diminished. With every species that is lost, creation can't reflect as much of the divine glory as it could. And if you kind of imagine the image of, maybe instead of reflecting, use the image of a choir, kind of a musical image. And every creature has a voice part in the great symphony of life. And and if you knock out a species, it's like knocking out half the tenor section, right? The music is not as rich as it would have been. And so we are slowly, not even slowly, in some cases, we are rapidly, because if you look at extinction rates, we're in the midst of a great extinction this very moment, largely caused by human forcings, we think. We are diminishing the ability of creation to reflect God's glory. And that's a massive loss. That's an incalculable loss in a way. And then the other piece of this idea of mirrors of God is the way that human beings reflect God's glory is precisely through imitating the lordship of Christ, is precisely through showing compassion and cherishing beauty and nurturing creation. That's how we reflect God's glory. And so when we fail to do that, we are taking ourselves out of the great symphony too. We are failing to reflect God's glory. And once again, creation becomes diminished by that. So my challenge to you, my hope for you is that next time you're out walking the dog, or going for a walk around town, or climbing a mountain, or looking at the changing leaves, or doing whatever it is you do to experience nature, and I hope you have ways that you do that, I hope you will pause to reflect on all these creatures all around you, all creatures of our God and King, and the way they are reflecting divine glory back to you. And then ask yourself, how am I reflecting divine glory toward them and to all those around us? And I think walking around with that sort of floating around in our minds and in our hearts and in our spirits can re-enchant the world in a new way. And I think that's something that we sorely need in this moment. So let us be mirrors of God, and let us do all we can to preserve all creatures of our God and King so that they can be mirrors of God. So that's my pitch. And I did pretty good there, Tom. I got it all in 7:56. I'm happy to spend any time that you all would like. If any of you have questions or comments or objections, I'm going to unshare my screen so that I can let's see, so I can see you all a little better. And
I will say, Richard, apropos of nothing, I'll say to everyone that Richard is mystified by the attention that I now turn to my own cat. I've never been a cat person myself, and just recently my wife and I got a kitten, and she just turned 6 months old yesterday. And I'm quite smitten, and it's like I'm a new man. So Richard's utterly mystified by that. So
truth be told, I have had cats, and I do love cats. So I'm making these cats. All these cat jokes are tongue in cheek, maybe just little shots at Tom. I know that I put an awful lot on the table, and I did it all in really rapid fire, and so I'm sorry for that. It didn't give you much time to process. But I'd love it if there are questions or comments or thoughts, or again, if you disagree, bring it on. Let's have a conversation about that.
Well, Richard, thank you very much. There was actually a lot of topics there that I had never actually thought on from that particular angle. And, I think it is true that 99% of all animals actually have gone extinct over the time. So, it's a difficult but sad process. But my question to you is, my perception is I never really hear religious leaders talking about climate change. It really doesn't seem to be on the agenda list.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, is that perception wrong, or why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. I think you're almost certainly right. And forgive me, I don't know what tradition you come out of. So I don't know if you're a friendship pres person or.
I met Tom through Ollie, but
great. All right.
I was through a Church of England in Australia. That was
right. Fantastic. So the current the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope has actually done some significant writing and speaking on the question of climate change. I would say that's probably the most significant religious figure that has addressed the topic quite forcefully.
Mhm.
But it does, I think you're right that in Protestant circles in particular, it barely shows up on the radar screen. And part of that is because I think certainly American Protestant Christianity is dominated by a kind of, by kind of evangelical tradition, which tends to pick up the things I critiqued early on,
Mhm.
a kind of strong eschatology, a strong dominionist theology. So the very things that I was naming as things that get in the way of a kind of proper vision of creation are really dominant in their theology. So it's kind of understandable why why
It's not
maybe
that way in the US,
that
right?
wouldn't show up. I think for Protestants in our tradition, for example, the Presbyterian tradition, who really should know better and do know better, but just don't talk about it very much, it's because, climate change doesn't really put people in the pews. I mean, if you're going to
No.
preach a series, I promise you, if I preach a series on climate change, attendance is going to, it's not a thrilling subject. It's not a,
Right.
it's hard to get our heads around. The reality of it can be a little daunting and depressing. I mean, it's a heavy lift. So I think clergy are, they're trying to get the leaky pipes fixed and get the children's programs off the ground. And so climate change just feels like
Right.
too heavy of a lift. But we do know better. We should know better. And there's actually a tradition. It's I think it came out of the Canadian church, and I've done this at a couple of congregations I've been at, where I think it's the month of September, leading into the first week of October, you have a season of creation. And for 5 Sundays, you talk about creation themes,
Mhm.
and then you end on the first Sunday of October, which is, you probably know, is the Feast of Saint Francis, which
Yeah.
is often
Yeah.
a creation theme, animal focused kind of day anyway. So it sort of builds to that. I have done that. I've not done it at my current congregation, but that's a way to get creation themes into the conversation. If
Mhm.
all you do is follow the lectionary and follow the liturgical cycle, in a way they don't show up. We haven't brought the proper lenses to the task. So that's one thing we could do, is kind of adopt that practice so we get it on the table. But no, your observation is right. And, it's kind of discouraging for those of us who talk about it and preach about it and even occasionally write about it.
Yeah. But I
Um,
love the idea that, and I totally agree with you, that the lordship sort of means stewardship of
yeah, right.
of the earth. And
That's right.
I had never thought about the first photo of Earth and then the whole Earth movement that started thereafter. I thought that was actually a very interesting point. So
Yeah. Well,
thank
thank
you.
you. Well, I appreciate that.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah. The that picture of Earthrise made me also think of the Carl Sagan Pale Blue Dot book, which is, of course, referring to a photo of Earth from much further away. I think from like Saturn or something like that, where the Earth really is just a pale blue dot. And Sagan makes, that wonderful point about, everything that anything about, everything that's ever happened that about happened right there, on that tiny dot. And that if that is as remarkable and dramatic an illustration of why we should care for one another, look out for one another, and take care of and cherish that pale blue dot, as the only home that we've ever known.
To the best of our knowledge, there's no plan B
Yeah,
for planet Earth.
right.
So, it's
I
important.
don't know whether you saw the 60 Minutes shows on these monkeys who have been on an island off Puerto Rico. Did you see that at all?
I don't think so. Say more about that.
So basically, these monkeys were brought there from India, and they're on an island, and there's no predators, and they've been studied for 80 years. And then a hurricane or a cyclone came through and just decimated the island. And so resources were limited, and people couldn't get to the island, and they got there and they found that the monkeys were actually more caring, less conflict, and were working together and generally had become more caring, which was contrary to a lot of people who would have said, wow, there's going to be a lot of fighting and battle over limited resources. And of course, as you say, the DNA is remarkably high. And that is true of often what we see in human nature as well, that in periods of stress and pressure, that the better side of humanity actually shows itself.
Yeah, there's some really fascinating research, which it sounds like maybe you've done some reading in on empathy and the way empathy functions in human beings and the way it functions in the natural world in animals as well. So sometimes sometimes in the past we've thought that empathy is a purely human thing and animals aren't capable of that. But no, we've demonstrated decisively that animals are very capable of empathy. And in fact, the same kind of mechanism that they use is the one we use to have empathy. So it's a fascinating, fascinating point.
Yeah.
What other comments or questions do y'all have?
This is Fred. I'd like to make a couple of comments, Richard, on your second slide
Fred.
and your third slide. I've been a student of Tom's now at SEL for 15 years, and we all love him there.
Yeah,
And one of the things, I was a weather forecaster. I'm 81 years old, 55 years ago. And when we had a hurricane come through, we would get about 15 inches of rain in one 24-hour period. Now, in the last 5 years, there's been 2 hurricanes that have hit the Beaumont, Texas, Houston, Texas area. 40 inches of rain and 60 inches of rain.
Yeah, it's
He's going to tell you something.
Yeah.
The other thing is too that you showed that slide about the fires.
Yeah.
When you have a forest that's very dry and there's a forest fire, the temperature gets up to 1,800 degrees. So when you see these homes that are burnt down and there's nothing left there, that's why.
Yeah.
The other thing too that's happening is in New Delhi right now, you've probably seen that huge city with all the smog and the people that are suffering their breathing.
Yeah.
And even on the Mississippi River right now, they're having trouble bringing the grain down in barges from the Midwest because of the drought.
Yeah.
So there's going to be areas where there's extreme drought and areas where there's going to be extreme rain.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that most of us don't begin to understand how it could very well affect us, because they're trying to get the grain down to New Orleans, and this grain is going to be taken to other countries where people can get fed. We're having enough trouble right now with the Ukraine where we can't get the grain there too.
Right. Fred, thank you so much for that comment. That's exactly right. And that slide I showed early on, which had kind of the 30,000 years of climate history and sort of the narrow band, which showed the Holocene, the 10,000 years of human civilization. The whole point is we built a whole civilization based on certain assumptions about where the water was going to be, right? Where rain was going to fall and where the rivers were going to run and where there would and would not be fires and where temperatures would reach certain points and where certain animals would migrate. Our whole civilization is built on those assumptions, but we have now left that world behind. The graph shows we have moved outside of that. So now all of the assumptions that we built our civilization on are some of them are starting to slip, and rain is showing up where we didn't think it would show up, or it's showing up in, as you say, in volumes that we are completely unprepared to handle, and temperatures are exceeding all sorts of expectations. We're going to see those kinds of impacts over and over again because we've built our civilization on a world that is shifting under our feet.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Which is a good point you made, Richard, which a lot of people I don't fully appreciate in this country, that there are winners and losers from climate change. North Canada, north parts of the US are clear winners, and the countries around the equator, where they're more dependent on their food because they provide their own food, and that's not going to be there. And you're going to see a massive migration from the central part of the world north. And a lot of people in America think that they're the only ones with an illegal immigration problem, but it is quite bad in the UK and all through Europe. And this is only going to get worse because they can't literally survive. And then you get to the mechanisms, as we've discussed with Brazil, like how do we compensate them for not burning their rainforests?
Right.
And, but in times of large budget deficits, there's not the resources to act as rationally as perhaps we should.
Well, indeed. And as everyone knows, climate change raises complicated economic and political issues. We could spend a lot of time having, I think, really good conversations about those things. But it mitigates against us making sometimes wise and thoughtful choices, because the economics and the politics get messy quickly, as you know.
Right.
But
Right.
as people, as talking to, out of the Christian tradition, I mean, we are called to put our faith above our economics and our politics. So, I mean, we shouldn't let that stop us from pursuing solutions, but, sometimes we trip over ourselves.
Yeah.
Human condition, I'm afraid.
Yes.
All right. What other questions we have, at least within the parameters of our original offering? We have 5 more minutes anyway. Any other questions or thoughts or lines of discussion?
Well,
I'm
just
Sandy, and I was just going to say, excuse me, I really appreciated your talk, and I knew nothing about Calvin, and I was most interested in what you had to say about infinite space and trying to fill it with finite things. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let's say that I am pretty sure if the churches don't get on the bandwagon, it's going to be too late to save this world, because I'm not seeing many people, myself included, who are willing to make the changes that are necessary to save us.
Yeah. I think partly why I pursue this through the theological lens is because I feel like, the kinds of changes that we would need to make are significant. They would entail, I don't want to sugarcoat that. They would entail sacrificing certain parts of our way of life that we've grown very accustomed to. And you would like to think that our faith tradition could motivate us to do that.
You would like to think.
Yeah. But it doesn't always. And so that can be a little discouraging, but we try to do our part of it. And there are certainly other folks that are motivated to address climate change for some of the other reasons I laid out. They recognize the self-fulfillment of nature or the ethical imperative. So there are other allies in the game, but I would like to see the church have a stronger role. But it's a work in progress.
Yeah.
Well, you're doing good work, so that's all you can do.
This is Fred again. Yeah, just to get off a little bit from the climate problem. The other problem that I see too is pollution. You see these documentaries where we see all of this plastic that's washing up on the shores all over the world, even on little isolated islands out in the middle of the Pacific. And how, with our population of almost 7 to probably 8 billion people now, that's going to be, just like the weather, another really big problem, because we don't know how all of that is going to, well, we know already how it's affecting with plastic bags, that a lot of the fish are swallowing, the fishing nets and all that type of thing. So it's, there's just so many things that are going on our earth that, because of our population and our advances in science, that we don't look to see what are going to be the impacts, not just to us, but all to the animals and plants around us.
No, that's exactly right. And if you could push it even further and talk about microplastics, and of course we know they're showing up. I think it is almost literally true that there is not a spot on Earth that isn't somewhat contaminated by microplastics. Like, we find them everywhere. So we've almost completely blanketed the planet in in plastic, micro or otherwise. Fred, yes, and there we could, loss of biodiversity is a huge, significant problem that's not directly related to climate change, but it's really important. The challenges all of these things can get, they're just heavy. They can feel kind of depressing and discouraging, And so finding ways for people to continue to be hopeful and engaged, I think is really critical work. And maybe part of it is, I think it's okay for us to spend a little time kind of grieving and acknowledging that, grieving and confessing, right? Grieving things that we have lost and are going to lose, and confessing the way that we haven't always acted with the best interests of creation. So grieving, confessing, and then turning to hopeful responses. Because if we don't do that, we sometimes can't handle the heaviness of it all, and we just put our heads in the sand. And I think that's a pretty common human response.
Absolutely. All right.
Just one more thing. Most of the scripture you quoted is in the Old Testament. So I know you wouldn't presume to speak for our Jewish brothers and sisters, but they should also have the same sort of philosophy about this, you know.
Oh, they 100% agree with me.
And they
I'm
do.
just kidding.
Well, they do,
I mean,
actually.
I
As a
think
matter of
in
fact.
general they would. And in fact, the Jewish tradition is even more unambiguous than the Christian tradition, at least on this point, that God does not give up on creation. And we are called not to give up on creation. The Jewish tradition really can't imagine this world just being thrown into the trash bin for some new world. That is just not a part of their tradition at all. Christianity has occasionally flirted with that idea, but I think at our best, we go along with our Jewish brothers and sisters that God is irrevocably committed to this world, and we should be as well.
Absolutely.
And
Okay.
so that means we still all need to step out individually and speak up, in calling on our church leaders to stand up there and speak it anyway, even though there's a fear of repercussion.
Yeah. I have to just note the irony of that, because Sean is in my congregation. And so, at least the first leader church leader that she's talking to is me. But more generally, yes, absolutely. There are things we can do as individuals, and we could talk for a long time about those things, but raising consciousness so that people bring these values with them into their churches, into their consumption habits, and frankly, into the voting booth, so that climate change and the environment more generally should always be on the ballot. It should be on the ballot every single election. And if we fought that way, we could change this trajectory pretty quickly.
Absolutely. All right. Well, let me make one last plug for Richard's book. It's great bedtime reading.
Because it puts you
Great bedtime reading. Down to Earth: Christian Hope and Climate Change by from Cascade Books. It is I guess you could say a kind of a popularized revision of your doctoral dissertation.
That's right.
Yeah. Richard and I get together either in person or on Zoom, have done so more or less weekly for about the last 14 years. And there were lots of conversations around a lot of the material in this book in the days leading up to it coming out. So I can highly recommend it. Highly recommend. I joke about the bedtime reading.
Well, thank you, Tom. And my thanks to all of you thanks, Tom and Friendship Press, for the opportunity to be at the forum. And my thanks to all of you for showing up. And I look forward to future conversations down the road.
All right.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Richard.
So much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
You all
you.
have a great
Thanks,
night.
Tom.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everybody.
All right.